May nilatang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang isap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning. Ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walhati pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang hinigaya na pag may mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Welcome everyone to the 8th and last session of our webinar series on Understanding 21st Century Democracy, organized by the University of Santo Tomas Research Center for Social Sciences and Education and the Fondazione Gravissimum Educationis in cooperation with the Teacher Education Council and the National Education Academy of the Philippines. We are thankful to all the participants who have been with us since the first webinar. We have participants, mainly social studies teachers from across different regions. If you remember, we started this project on August 15, 2020, with Dr. Tina Nabachi of Syracuse University, USA, who delivered a keynote address on citizenship skills for democracy, and Dr. Edson Tandok Jr. of Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, who spoke about democracy in social media and the public sphere. On August 22, 2020, Dr. Barbara Wedgner of the University of Buffalo, USA, gave a lecture on democracy in time of disasters, which included countries' responses to the pandemic. The following month, Dr. Sorpong Pugh of Ryerson University in Canada shared his thoughts on democracy and human rights, one of the controversial topics identified by our participants in the last online survey. In the second strand of the series, we were glad and honored that Dr. Gert Bista of the Moray House School of Education and Sport and the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, accepted our invitation. We listened to his keynote address on democracy as an educational commitment. This was followed by a plenary session with Dr. David Zinger of Southern Cross University in Australia, who enthusiastically shared his research on the different kinds of citizenship. On October 24, 2020, Professor Kerry John Kennedy of the Education University of Hong Kong gave a lecture on institutions and democratic development, teaching for understanding and values. Then in November 2020, Dr. Teresa Alviar Martin of Kennesaw State University gave an enlightening lecture on democracy in the school curriculum. She pointed out the existing disconnections between schools and students' lived realities, as well as perceptions among citizens of their inability to have a voice in policy decision-making. It is therefore our role to honestly and mindfully address the disconnection between the ideal democracy and the real and actual conditions of society. 2 weeks ago, we started the third segment of the series with Dr. Mark Anthony Abenir of the Ateneo de Manila University, introduced us to service learning as a method of teaching and learning and as a way to integrate community service activities in the curriculum. It is widely used to educate students about participatory or justice-oriented citizenship geared toward democracy building. With the 4 types of service learning, direct, indirect, advocacy, and research, Dr. Abenir explained how these service learning types create positive learning experiences for students and communities. During the pandemic, he proposed an e-service learning hybrid model where instruction is coupled by service conducted partially on-site and partially online. In his sociological model, he pushed for what he termed as empowering service learning that focuses on solidarity-based school-community partnerships that is long-term and characterized by intensive involvement of students, the teaching staff, and the community partners. Combining the benefits of charity-based, critical, and community-based service learning, and empowering service learning can maximize the use of experiential, reflective, critical, emancipatory, constructive, and reciprocal learning. Education is at the heart of a sustainable future for all of us. It is not only a basic right for every man, woman, and child, it also forms the foundation for every other kind of human right. making it the key to the success of all Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. Let us watch a 4-minute video published by the UNESCO on education within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
For all our differences and diversity, the world can agree on one thing: education is at the heart of a sustainable future for us all. In 2015, voices from all sectors of society and all corners of the globe contributed to one of the greatest collaborations in history: an ambitious plan for people, planet, and prosperity. A plan to wipe out poverty by 2030 and pave the way to an inclusive and sustainable future. A plan to build on human rights with education at its very core. Education is not only a basic right for every woman, man, and child. It forms the foundation for every kind of human right, making it key to the success of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 and to the future of every individual on the planet. With hundreds of millions of children and youth around the world still missing out, and millions more leaving school without the skills they need, the Global Education 2030 Agenda is focused on a vital goal of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. The sheer scale of this commitment calls for the highest levels of coordination, partnership, and collaboration across the globe. Guided by the Education 2030 Framework for Action, which sets out a clear game plan for countries and key partners, the SDG Education 2030 Steering Committee plays a critical role as a central driving force to keep everyone moving in the right direction. Convened by UNESCO, the Steering Committee is a democratic, multi-stakeholder partnership made up of mostly member states representing all regions, as well as the United Nations agencies, international and regional organizations, representatives of civil society, the private sector, foundations, and youth. Drawing on the strength of this diverse partnership, the Steering Committee works to provide strategic guidance to member states and the education community at large, and advise on critical action to bring about change, all the while advocating for the resources needed to support transformation. The Steering Committee also takes the reins for accountability, monitoring progress towards Education 2030 targets through UNESCO's Institute for Statistics and the Global Education Monitoring Report. Within the greater UN SDG picture, the Steering Committee engages at regional, national, and global levels to ensure that everyone working towards education targets is pulling in the same direction, with two-way communication on all fronts to keep strategies aligned and efforts in sync. The Steering Committee also partners with global bodies linked to the SDG framework. Through its far-reaching global network and focused sense of agency, the Steering Committee is a force for scaling up innovation, resources, and action, expanding the power of partnership and collaboration across all sectors of society and the global development community. Achieving our goal for a world of quality education and lifelong learning for every person on the planet is a shared responsibility for us all. Let's stand together in our commitment to giving every woman, man, and girl and boy their right to a critical foundation and the opportunity to play their part in building our sustainable future. Follow our work at www.sdgforeducation2030.org and at Education 2030 UN. For all our differences and diversity,
we can agree that education can definitely impact the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, in many Philippine schools and universities, they try to map how their courses contribute to the attainment of such goals, emphasizing as well research, outreach, and stewardship. In the Times Higher Education 2020 ranking, the top Philippine universities in terms of addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are the University of Santo Tomas, the University of Asia and the Pacific, the De La Salle University, and Mapua University. Allow me to introduce our keynote speaker. He is a professor of character and citizenship education in the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, University of Birmingham, United Kingdom. His research focuses broadly on civic virtues and education. His recent books include Civility and Democratic Education and Compassion in Education, Cultivating Compassionate Children, Schools and Communities. He is an assistant editor of the British Journal of Educational Studies, an associate editor of the Asia Pacific Journal of Education, and a deputy editor of Citizenship Teaching and Learning. He is also adjunct professor of education at the University of South Australia. Fellow teachers, to deliver the keynote address, Doing Service Learning to Democratize Society, we are very happy to have with us Professor Dr. Andrew Peterson. Dr. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Joel. I will just share my screen if that's okay. Well, Joel, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this series of events, and the previous events certainly sound very important, and hopefully this presentation today and the focus will build on and build on the previous events and have something interesting to say about doing service learning as a way to democratize society. So thank you everybody for being here, and thanks again for inviting me. As Joel has mentioned, I'm a professor of character and citizenship education at the University of Birmingham in the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues. My email address is on the bottom of the screen, so please do get in contact with me if there's anything in the presentation you'd like to follow up, and the Jubilee Centre's website address is there, where some of the reports and studies that I'll mention today can be found. So please do get in contact with us and have a look at the site. In the presentation today, I'd like to just go over a few things. So firstly, I want to set out some key definitions of service learning and democracy, and also relational values, and then also talk about the way that schools, teachers, school leaders, and also students themselves, and perhaps actually everybody, negotiate service learning and negotiate democracy. And then to say some things about the importance of relational virtues in doing service learning as a way to democratize society. In the presentation, I'll be drawing on some research, some observations of practice, and some experiences over the course of my career so far that really have been focused on, well, what does it mean to be an active citizen? What does it mean to be engaged in the experiential educational process of service learning? And how does this connect to either theoretical constructs of democracy, or perhaps more importantly, sort of everyday democracy, and how young people engage in democracy, and how schools as institutions engage in democracy, and the types of democracy in which they engage. So there's three areas to my talk: some definitional work, some thoughts about negotiating service learning, and then some thoughts about the role and the importance of relational virtues in service learning, particularly in terms of democratizing education and society. So let's start with some definitions. So service learning is the general term. There's been a trend, particularly in the UK, to use the term social action. So actually in the UK, social action perhaps is a more common term that's used. But what is service learning? What is social action? And how do these definitions underpin the presentation that I'll be giving? Well, the key book, foundational book, seminal book, Where's the Learning in Service Learning by Isler and Giles, 1999. Service learning is a form of experiential education. That's absolutely crucial. The experiential part of it, participating in democracy, children, young people, engaging in the lives of their communities, in which learning occurs through a cycle of action and reflection. So experience enhances understanding, and understanding leads to more effective action. Campaign for Youth Social Action in the UK several years ago defined social action, and although they're not strictly the same, I'll perhaps use service learning and social action interchangeably in the presentation. So practical action in the service of others, and the key word there is service, which which we'll come back to. So practical action in the service of others in order to create positive social change that is of benefit to the wider community as well as to the young person themselves. So I think there's some key thinking that we need to do there, and come on to this later in the presentation, about that balance, the relationship, and what it means to benefit the wider community as well as the young person themselves. And character.org from the United States, one of their 11 principles of effective character education through meaningful experiences and reflection opportunities, schools with a culture of character, schools with a democratic culture of character, we might add, help pupils to develop their commitment to being honest and trustworthy, to volunteer their time and talents to the common good, and when necessary, to show courage to stand up for what is right. So already we see some virtues appearing there, and some thoughts about the character of young people and the character of democracy as a whole, and the things that are valued in democracy, so honesty, trustworthiness, and courage. So these definitions are important and underpin the rest of the presentation. But what does democracy mean? So I think when we talk about, well, doing service learning as a way to democratize society, we need to think about what democracy means. And I'd like to propose, in terms of my presentation, that democracy is more than the state and the market. So often we find ourselves perhaps in wider life, we confine ourselves to thinking about democracy as the relation between citizens and the state, or a very market-orientated approach to democratization, sometimes a transactional approach to democracy. But democracy is more than that. So democracy involves relations between citizens that move between the state, the market, and our everyday lives and relationships. And certainly in my research in the UK, in Australia, and projects, comparative projects in various countries around the world, young people in particular, perhaps even more so than their teachers and their educators, talk about democracy in a reasonably fluid way. So they don't necessarily talk about the local citizenship, national citizenship, global citizenship. Well, they do when they're pushed, but actually in their conversations, they talk about this and the movement between these spheres and between the spheres of the state, the market, and our everyday relationships in much more open and fluid ways. So I think democracy involves, or it's important to remember, that democracy is about the state, it is about the market, but perhaps even more so, it's about everyday lives and everyday relationships with our communities, with our peers, in our neighbourhoods, and that branches out and mediates our relationships on wider levels, whether that's regional, national, or global. And it certainly does for young people. And also recognising that people have different motivations and different reasons for participating in their democracy and engaging in service learning. And whatever those motivations, generally underpinned in some sense with holding out hope or working together with others for the common good. Now, in terms of education for citizenship, education for democracy, I think there's a tendency to focus on typologies, a tendency to focus on different types of citizenship, and often to talk about these in overly dichotomous ways, so to try and draw distinctions. So those distinctions might be, for example, between passive citizenship and active citizenship, between soft citizenship and critical citizenship, between citizenship which occurs in social groups and social environments, and citizenship that occurs in the political realm and is more to do with that relationship with state, or perhaps even relationship with the political. There's distinctions in the literature on youth activism and active citizenship between the formal and the informal participation, between engagement offline and engagement online, between perhaps more traditional forms of political involvement, such as voting, registering to be a member of a political party, and we might call these newer forms of political organisation that young people are typically seen to be more interested in, that are issue-based, that are collective. And often those typologies and those dichotomies are used in some judgmental way to try and suggest, well, actually, it's better for citizens and young people to be soft, to be critical rather than soft, to be active rather than passive. That they prefer engagement online than offline, or that their engagement online isn't actual engagement. So we've probably heard the term of clicktivism, that you can be, the activist online, but also slacktivism, that just liking something isn't actual participation and citizenship in your democracy. That young people tend towards these new issue-based, perhaps more ad hoc connections rather than traditional politics. But I just wonder whether that's sort of missing the point. And actually, the more important point is, how do young people engage in these different areas? So engage in soft citizenship and critical citizenship, engage in the social and the political at different points of their lives and for different reasons and at different times. Some of them may be constrained by various factors. So it's not always possible to engage in the sort of critical active citizenship that we always might desire of, to be active democratic citizens and critical citizens. And so as educators, we need to perhaps take a step back and be less judgmental and think, well, what is possible for young people and how do they come to democracy? How do they engage in service within and for their communities? And how do they move between these different forms? So how do they move between the online and the offline, for example? Why do they choose to act online or offline? How do they choose to mediate, do these new forms of issue-based politics or newer forms of issue-based politics and service learning enable them to collect to more traditional forms of politics? Or actually, do they engage in issue-based politics, online politics, because they feel excluded from those traditional, and how do they bridge the gap? So I think democracy is a much more complex term. And certainly young people's engagement in democracy and engagement in service to, with and for their communities is much more complex. And we always have to start with the young people, think about, well, how do they approach democracy? How do they come to democracy and their engagement with others? Now, in terms of relational virtues, at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Values, Character and Virtues, we focus on virtues rather than values per se. So virtues are stable, positive traits of character that are morally worthwhile, educable, and help us to live a good life in common with others. In this presentation, I'm going to be focused broadly on what might be called relational virtues. So those are the virtues that enable us to help and work positively with others in our communities for their common good. And these involve critical awareness and a motivation to act. And I think sometimes with service learning, so far as citizenship education is concerned, we can perhaps be overly focused on process. So experiential learning, experiential processes are very important, but actually it's what underpins those processes and the goals of those processes, the aims of those processes, the virtues that young people bring with them and already hold to their engagement with others and to their service learning activities, but also the virtues that young people can learn in and through their democratic participation through service learning. And actually, when we talk to young people, we look at the studies on young people, it's these virtues, whether the young people use the term virtue, of course, is another matter. They don't necessarily have this vocabulary, and some may see the term virtue to be anachronistic, but it's often about supporting the community. It's often about developing a sense of belonging within the community or wanting to express that sense of belonging. And it's often about the connections that sustain a habit of service. And it's absolutely crucial that we think about service learning as something that's sustainable. And it's about creating habits and fostering habits that enable further participation as young people move through their democratic lives. Okay. So if we move now to negotiating service learning. So I want to suggest that certainly as far as research is concerned, and my own experiences and my own research with school leaders, with teachers and with young people, that teachers, school leaders and young people themselves are always in a constant process of negotiating service learning, just as we as adults are negotiating our way through democracy and always critically thinking about democracy, that this isn't a straightforward process. That young people and teachers and educators are always negotiating service learning in various ways. So what does that look like? Well, at the Jubilee Centre, this is our framework for character. And you'll see there that, that we divide character and virtues into 4 building blocks. This is underpinned by a neo-Aristotelian frame, and absolutely crucial. Although performance virtues are instrumentally important, absolutely crucial are intellectual, moral and civic virtues that come together to enable young people, enable citizens more widely to participate in the lives of their communities. Crucial is practical wisdom, which is the integrative virtue developed through experience and critical reflection. which enables us to perceive, know, desire and act with good sense. And this includes discerning deliberative action in situations where virtues collide. And the hope is that this then develops flourishing individuals and societies. So it's absolutely crucial that as educators, we think about those intellectual, moral and civic virtues, capacities, qualities, however we want to frame it, that enable young people to engage with their communities, to build that belonging, to build the solidarity and to build those connections that can sustain their engagement with democracies. And I think it's important to say that this also includes, whether it's through the intellectual virtues of critical thinking, autonomy of reasoning, whether it's through the moral virtues and the moral stroke civic virtues of compassion, civility, humility, etc., justice, or through the integrative virtue of practical wisdom. But a key goal here is to enable young people to be critically aware of the barriers that either they themselves are facing or that others within their communities are facing in terms of democracy and being able to flourish. So a term that's commonly used in terms of social action in the UK is the double benefit. So social action, double benefit view goes, develops a range of capacities in young people which simultaneously work to build and enhance communities with which young people engage. The process is one through which young people connect with the issues they feel passionately about and which affect others, and this brings together people from different backgrounds and communities. So how are teachers working and how do young people work with and through the double benefit? And here I think, as I've said, they're constantly negotiating this double benefit. So they're always trying to balance the benefits. So the benefits to the individual and the benefits to the society, a very simplistic but often cited issue with young people's service learning is that service learning can often be undertaken because it looks good on the CV, because it provides a stepping stone to higher study, to employment. So there are individual benefits, but those individual benefits can be directed in different ways. It's always a balance. When we talk to providers of service learning opportunity, when we, sorry, somebody's raised their hand. I don't know if I need to, but Joel, perhaps you'll tell me if I need to do anything with that. So when we talk to providers of social action activities, when we talk to young people, when we talk to teachers in schools, they're constantly negotiating this balance between supporting the young people themselves, supporting students to engage with communities for their own benefits, for the benefits for the young people, and the benefits for society. And we'll come to that when we look at teacher perspectives and young people's perspectives. We also have to think about directing the societal benefit as well. And again, this is a constant negotiation. So some engagement in service learning will be about the immediate and the short term, but actually, perhaps more importantly, engagement in service learning will be about addressing structural long-term issues. And here I think is where sometimes we can be overly judgmental of teachers and young people, in that whilst we would all want them to be engaged in service learning opportunities that are about addressing structural inequalities, that are about addressing structural injustices, and that are long term, sometimes their way in, sometimes what's possible in certain contexts and certain circumstances is the more immediate, is the more short term societal benefit. So again, my experience working with schools and research, which we'll come on to, is that teachers are often highly aware of these issues that are there between trying to engage children in societal benefit, and trying to mediate these pressures to engage in immediate short-term action, but also structural long-term action. In terms of individual benefit, David Brooks's work, a US author, on character, his book, The Road to Character, is quite useful in thinking about how we can redirect or direct the individual benefit. And here, so Brooks makes the distinction between the resume virtues and eulogy virtues. So the resume virtues, the things that young people develop that look good on their CV, that look good when they're going for jobs and trying to get employed. But those eulogy virtues that when we come to the end of our lives, we look back and this is how we remember, this is the type of person we are. And again, I think that's hard with the current pressures that many schools and teachers are under in terms of marketization, high stakes accountability. It's easy to be judgmental in terms of teachers' work, and are they trying to develop resume virtues for young people? So is service learning directed towards those resume virtues, the benefit of young people to get jobs, to look good in their CV, to progress in their lives? Or is service learning directed towards the more eulogy virtues of honesty, compassion, etc., the type of people that young people can be and are? So redirecting that individual benefit, again, teachers and young people themselves are constantly trying to negotiate this tension between things that look good for instrumental reasons and the intrinsic benefits of participation and engagement in youth social action and service. We should also be absolutely mindful of imbalances of power in service. So my diagram, not the best with diagrams, but hopefully my diagram will make sense. So if we think about the characters in blue as the young people who are undertaking service, and the characters in orange as the sort of receivers of that service, as it were, that power imbalances are absolutely there and a key part in the educational process and a key part of teachers' work and young people's work in negotiating service learning is to think about these imbalances of power. So in the first example, we might have, it's common within the literatures to have a concern that those undertaking service are in some way positioning themselves as saviours. So Vanessa Andreotti's work on critical global citizenship is a key example of this. That always a key, has brought this to people's attention. That actually sometimes young people can be presented or can present themselves as sort of rescuers, as saviours, there as sort of to produce palliative care and palliative responses. And to some extent, we might think this as service as imposed on others, as a doing to others, rather than working with others in common with others. So we can have this a concern, this power imbalance, that the givers of service, that when young people undertake service, that they might be imposing their service upon others. But equally, we might also have a power imbalance, or can have a power imbalance the other way, so that when young people are involved in service, they need to be put off by this concept of service. So some studies that the Jubilee Centre ran a few years ago that looked at youth social action in the UK. Youth social action providers and young people themselves are actually put off by the term service. So one said, we would never use the term service, and we find that young people have quite a violent reaction to this term service because they see it as in line with sort of being subservient and being servile, and then actually sort of they view it as limiting their own power and their own standing as democratic citizens. So we have to be mindful that teachers, young people, social action providers, service learning providers are always negotiating, always mediating these imbalances of powers. And absolutely crucial is for young people to have the opportunity to critically reflect on these imbalances and try and negotiate their way, as I'll come to later, hopefully informed by and guided by relational virtues, to guide their way through these relationships that are there in service learning, that are there in communities, and are there in democratic involvement more widely. Okay, so let's think about the role of relational virtues and how relational virtues might play a part in shaping and directing service learning, democratically speaking. So thinking about the perspectives of school leaders and teachers. So I've undertaken quite extensive research in the UK, in Australia, and been involved in a project that looked at education for youth activism and new forms of youth activism across 6 different countries, which are Australia, the UK, Canada, Hungary, Singapore, and Lebanon. And that work and other research in the field has generally demonstrated that, as I've said, teachers, school leaders, those working with young people are constantly mediating the various discourses and pressures that are placed upon them. So we know about high stakes accountability, we know about the impact of marketisation, and we know that schools are often judged by governments and by parents and by others as competitive organisations working in competition with others, and judged by their grades, judged by their employability statistics, and judged by things other than the holistic education of children, the way that they develop democratic citizenship the way that they develop character and form character, and so on. And actually teachers, school leaders are well aware of this. And so a lot of work in talking with school leaders and teachers is to understand how they may mediate these various discourses and pressures. So it's not that they ignore that high stakes accountability, it's not that they ignore the marketization of education, it's not that they ignore those pressures, but they're constantly working with ways to try and balance the books, as it were, to try and balance and appease the different pressures that are on their time. So I think that's absolutely crucial, that school leaders there to educate children, to lead educational institutions, put under huge amounts of pressure, but actually are working actively to try and mediate those pressures, to try and reduce those pressures on children and young people, and to give them opportunities. And obviously some school leaders do a better job at that than others, and some see the democratic side of their role and democratic life of their school is more important than others. But it's a constant process of mediation. And where this mediation works better and works best is when there's a democratic culture and ethos within the school, and that enables the school leaders and teachers to connect service learning, to connect developing relational values with the democratic culture and ethos of the school. And again, schools are complex organizations, just like democracy, and democratic institutions are complex organizations. So what we find in the research, and in our research, is that teachers often are working to find ways to develop these relational virtues. So they're finding ways to develop, often in competition with outside pressures, often in competition with other pressures within the school. So if we think about this, this example, so this is a senior leader in an Australian high school. So I was undertaking research on how Australian high schools educate for global citizenship education. And these were all schools, so the sample of schools, a purposive sample, these were all schools that stated a commitment to developing global citizenship. So it was a key part of their ethos, key part of their mission and vision statement. And in our conversations with the head teacher, the senior leader was criticising other forms of service learning that occurred within the school. And he was, criticising in the sense of, well, here's the fundraising, often students, they call it gold coin donation in Australia, where students are bringing in $1 coin or a $2 coin, gold coins, throwing it into a hat, and they get to wear their own clothes for the day. They don't really know what the event is or what the charity is that they're raising money for, what the event is, and it's not sustainable. So this senior leader reflected in criticality of what else went on in the school, some other elements that went on in the school. And he said in his work as a school leader, for us to get involved, we've got to have community partners. And our community partners are either local or international. So for us to get involved, there has to be the following things. So firstly, there has to be an educational component. Then there has to be pupil involvement in the whole process, which means that most of our projects come from pupils. So absolutely crucial there is trying to develop and connect in with that wider democratic ethos within the school. And we also, I thought this was really important, we also believe that there has to be some sort of time frame for the involvement, and usually the time frame will be 5 years. So again, if we go back to that double benefit and framing that double benefit in terms of that structural long-term involvement, if we commit ourselves to a partner, it's a 5-year partnership which has set goals. So the aim should be to try and achieve sustainability in that project. And then fourthly, it needs to be pupil managed as well. So again, we see the democratic culture within the school and the democratic organisation within the school. Usually we will have a pupil project manager who will run the project from our end. Okay. So absolutely crucial for the senior leader was to engage pupils, was to absolutely fundamentally underpin that educational component. What's notable in what he says, he just talks about community partners. So he doesn't go back to those dichotomies of the political and the social, of the critical and the soft. He fundamentally talks about where pupils are, and that relationship with the community partners as being absolutely fundamental. So relationships are key, and forging and helping pupils to develop that relationship, spurred by their own interest, spurred by their own management, but developing that relation with community partners, whether local, international, national, and so on. Now, when we turn to the perspectives of children, actually we also find, children and young people, we also find that children and young people are also mediating the various discourses and pressures. And what I found in various studies in different contexts, so teaching global citizenship in Australian high schools, working with refugee and asylum seeker children in schools in England, social action activities nationally in England, talking to those involved in youth activism, either research or actively engaged in youth activism across these 6 countries that I mentioned previously. Children and young people are absolutely cognizant of the need to mediate these various discourses and pressures that are placed on them in terms of their engagement and their service learning and engagement with democracies. And what comes through quite clearly is that they're also aware of the constraints on schools and the constraints on school leaders. And they want to learn more about context. So they're aware of these constraints and often want to learn more about context. So what we see is that these young people, and what the research tends to suggest, is that young people can become frustrated, and often they are frustrated. So even in schools that have what we might call a strong democratic culture and a strong culture of service learning, young people are frustrated often by the limits on their opportunities to engage in service and engage in the complexities of service. And I think crucial to this is that they don't necessarily see their service learning as unconnected, or they don't see their service learning as unconnected to other areas of the curriculum. So to sort of simplify the point, to try and capture what I mean, often when I'm talking to school leaders and teachers, and we're reading research on school leaders and teachers, they will talk about formal learning and formal opportunities and formal structures. So when you say to, just to give an example, you say to school teachers and school leaders, this was certainly true of the study I did on global citizenship education in Australia, will tell me about the opportunities that young people have to engage with difference, to engage with others, to engage with their communities. Those teachers would talk about the formal. So they would talk about the curriculum, they would talk about the diversity day, they would talk about the activity where children go and engage in a particular service learning project. But when you talk to students and young people and to the pupils and to the students at the school, they talk much more fluidly. So they talk about the informal more. So they talk about their conversations with their peers, the fluidity between their school life and their wider life outside of school, the fluidity between what they learn in the curriculum and the service learning opportunities. So perhaps they make connections, but they do so in a really fluid way when they talk about their educational experiences and also their democratic lives. But as I've said, they also get frustrated. And so some of these frustrations I think are relevant and important for service learning. So they talk about their frustrations in terms of the curriculum. So they talk about that the curriculum constrains them in many ways to learn about context, to learn about others. And sometimes that's teachers constraining them. So young people in the schools in Australia that I spoke to about their involvement in service learning as part of their global citizenship education would say actually they don't get to engage with the controversial issues because the curriculum doesn't allow it, or they're only allowed to engage in the controversial issues and the issues at hand where the curriculum allows it. They're aware that oftentimes their teachers don't necessarily have the confidence or feel supported enough to develop their critical consciousness, to develop their understanding of the realities of democratic life and the issues at hand in democratic life, whether that's locally, nationally, or globally. So they talk about restricted engagement. They talk often about restricted engagement in context and understanding context, often framed, this was in Australia, but also in the UK, as about reluctance, for example, of schools to engage with religious matters and religious controversies and religious tensions and questions. But also, and I think this is important as well, they talk about the role of schools and the way that schools often frame diversity in a rather celebratory way and limit framing of diversity and engagement with diversity and diverse communities in a rather celebratory and sort of passive way. It's about understanding diversity. It's about celebrating diversity. I'm not suggesting that isn't important. Absolutely, both of those are important. But they talk about the need and the desire to critically engage with diversity, to try and understand it more. They're aware of their own limitations sometimes in understanding the diversity that they see in their local, national and global communities, and see understanding that diversity and engaging critically with that diversity is an absolutely fundamental marker of and of fundamental importance for their engagement in service learning. So young people talk fluidly about their educational experiences and democratic life, and they're often interested in and motivated by the connection of others, and often that's spurred by individual teachers. So I think leadership of schools is absolutely vital. There's lots of work about the importance of leadership of schools in creating democratic character formation within schools and having that within the mission and ethos of schools. But actually, in a number of studies that I've undertaken and the Jubilee Centre have undertaken, individual teachers are crucial, and often it's individual teachers that can make, or groups of teachers that can make the difference for young people. So I think this is a really important quote. So this is a piece of work by some colleagues of mine in the UK who've looked at perspectives of quite young children on engagement with in service learning and engagement with charities and charitable fundraising and philanthropy. And they say that in contrast to perhaps some of the wider literature and some of the views that adults take on charitable engagement, that children tend to see charity as focusing on acts of everyday kindness. So viewing charity as much more than a monetary donation. I think that's crucial. So when we look at sometimes the critical work in active citizenship and in democratic citizenship education, can be quite critical of charity and fundraising. But when we start from the position of young people, maybe perhaps they see that charity, rather than just being a simple donation, a simple transaction, is actually an embodiment of a set of behaviours, set of actions and values that are rooted in these ideas of kindness, fairness and empathy, and are seen as the building blocks of social justice and democracy. I think it's a really interesting and important way of thinking about service learning within schools and for young people, and relational virtues such as kindness, such as fairness, such as empathy and belonging and connecting with communities as being the building blocks of social justice and democracy. It doesn't suggest that these are all that are needed, that these are completely the totality of social justice and democracy, but for young people, they do provide important building blocks for social justice and democracy. Okay, so how can we use relational virtues to navigate democracy? So I'm just checking the time. Well, hopefully throughout the presentation so far, I've at least been implicit, if not explicit, in that teachers, young people, school leaders, social action providers and those engaged in service learning are constantly negotiating democracy. And that, as the last slide says, that notions of kindness, fairness, empathy, justice enable and can play a role in helping teachers, young people, etc., to navigate democracy and navigate service learning. So just to sort of conclude this, I think that using relational virtues can help navigate democracy in a few ways. Well, firstly, it can provide a moral and civic vocabulary. So another thing that's shown by studies or can often come out through studies on working with young people, certainly true of my work in schools in global citizenship education in Australia. Previous studies, Jubilee Centre on a habit of service and developing character through social action have suggested that where young people have a moral and civic vocabulary, and a critical moral and civic vocabulary, so this isn't about providing a set idea about kindness or set idea about friendship or compassion or whatever virtue might be in play, but a critical sense of their own understanding and how those virtues play out within the community and understood by their community, can give them a framework for thinking through their action and for thinking through their relation to others within their democratic lives. So service learning provides a prism and an opportunity for young people to come together to connect with others and to build relationships, and something that's seen to be important in studies, particularly longitudinal studies, that look at what sustains a habit of service, a habit of service learning within democratic communities, is this sense of forging relationships and connections with others. So to have a moral and civic vocabulary to discuss those relationships and to reflect on those relationships, including problems and issues within democratic communities, is proven to be absolutely vital. So in many schools that we work with at the Jubilee Centre, we say that actually having that moral and civic vocabulary doesn't necessarily mean there's consensus, doesn't mean that young people, teachers, school leaders, etc. are uncritical, but it means that they can come together and share and think about this common, their interactions and their engagements. And I think if we think about wider democratic society, it's not true of all countries, but certainly in certain countries like the UK and perhaps like America as well, that this sort of shared vocabulary and a shared understanding of key democratic virtues, key democratic values, has perhaps been under severe pressure, and that we can see some of the divisions as being a direct result of this lack of shared moral and civic vocabulary, and a critical sense, and seeking to understand the moral and civic vocabulary of others. So another, relational values and that moral and civic vocabulary is absolutely crucial in helping young people through their service learning activities to make connections. And make connections in a whole variety of ways. So make connections with others, with their community partners, with others within the community, with their peers within schools, with their friends, but also make connections between their experiences. So I was always mindful of a conversation I had with a school. So even though these schools that I've worked with and researched in Australia, focusing on global citizenship education, all professed and had a clear commitment to educating for global citizenship. They did that in various different ways and to various different depths and degrees. And one of the schools that had activities but didn't quite have the depth of some of the other schools that I was researching. So having a conversation with two senior leaders there, and one of them said, as part of our conversation, do you know what we don't have? What we have is we have lots of activities dotted about, but we have nothing that joins the dots, nothing that joins up those activities. So actually for young people, finding something that joins the dots, that helps them to make connections, is absolutely crucial. And I think this moral and civic vocabulary is a key part of that process. And then helping young people to seek to understand themselves, so that young people come as citizens and they're developing citizens as well. So seeking to understand themselves, seeking to understand others, and crucially seeking to understand the context in which they engage in service learning, in which they engage in their communities, whether local, regional, national or global, is absolutely fundamental. So those relational values, going back to the building blocks that we talked about previously and the different types of virtues, can provide a framework for supporting schools and teachers and young people to seek to understand themselves and seek to understand context. But I think absolutely crucial in that is one final point, and that's that schools aren't necessarily able to do this alone. They have to be supported in doing this by the wider society and wider democratic cultures. And in communities where schools are unsupported, or there are barriers to that support and building and forging communities, whether that's through policy or whether that's through poverty or other constraints, then schools will be limited, and schools are often working their absolute best to develop these opportunities for young people. And there's been some really interesting studies recently by an author in America called Scott Cedar and his colleagues on critical consciousness and the development of character. And this work investigates the development of young people's critical consciousness as democratic citizens and their civic character in a range of different schools. And again, going back to these constraints and teachers navigating the pressures. And so this work sort of differentiates between perhaps more progressive schools, what the authors term progressive schools, and schools that are seen to be sort of no excuses, the charter schools, the no excuse schools. And what they find in the studies, it seems to be the case that progressive schools are in their sort of service learning activities in their democratic education raise, they see a notable increase in young people's critical analysis. So able to critically analyse in these progressive schools injustices, the need for change, etc. But perhaps less of an increase, or definitely less of an increase, in their motivation to challenge those injustices. Whereas conversely, in no excuse schools, as these authors term them, they witness an increase in the motivation to challenge injustices, but perhaps less of an increase in the critical analysis of the injustices and sort of understanding those injustices and the causes of those injustices. So I think it's important to note that schools will not necessarily be able to do everything, and that each school, whilst they will strive to perhaps both raise critical citizens through their service learning, but also citizens willing and able to make a change and motivated to challenge injustices, it may well be the case that they're perhaps working more towards one of these ends than towards another. So I think that brings me to the end of my time. I'd like to thank you again for listening to the presentation and for inviting me here. My email address was on the first slide, and please do get in contact if you have any questions or anything you'd like to follow up. So thank you, and I'll hand back over to Joel. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. Dr. Peterson shared what service learning is all about, how it can provide learners with meaningful experiences and reflective opportunities that actually benefit both the learners and the community. I like how he mentioned about relationships. It is that relationship between and among learners, teachers, and the community that makes service learning a democratic strategy. It is the participation of learners and their engagement in citizenship behaviors. I appreciate also how Dr. Peterson explained how relational values like kindness, compassion, and empathy can help navigate service learning and democracy, and how service learning can have the potential to develop intellectual, moral, civic, and performance virtues, not just in the tertiary level, but I suppose also at the basic education level. Dr. Peterson talked about the double benefit. On the part of the learners, we would want them to engage in relevant issues, especially the so-called controversial public issues. But at the same time, we want them to be able to contribute through direct or indirect services or advocacy programs. And I think that the role of the teacher remains crucial to encourage students to get involved and manage their service learning projects. He mentioned also about constraints, teacher constraints and curricular constraints. Service learning in the Philippines is not yet institutionalized, and I think it would take time for teachers and learners to learn and eventually embrace service learning as an important component of the curriculum. So thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. It was such an interesting discussion. At this point, we now move to the plenary talk. Our plenary speaker is the Wei Yan Chair Distinguished Professor of Education at the Beijing Normal University. He is also the John Bascom Professor of Curriculum and Instruction and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He holds distinguished professor appointments at the University of Manchester and Northeast Normal University in China. A former elementary and secondary school teacher and past president of a teachers union, he worked with educational systems, governments, universities, unions, and activists and dissident groups throughout the world, democratize educational research, policy, and practice. Dr. Apple has written extensively on the politics of educational reform, on the relationship between culture and power, and on education for social justice. Among his recent books are the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Education, the Routledge International Handbook of Sociology of Education, Global Crises, Social Justice in Education, and most recently, Knowledge, Power, and Education, and Can Education Change Society? His books and articles have won numerous awards and have been translated into many languages. Professor Apple has been selected as one of the 50 most important educational scholars of the 20th century. His books, Ideology and Curriculum, and Official Knowledge were also selected as two of the most significant books on education in the 20th century. He has been awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Educational Research Association, the UCLA Medal for Outstanding Academic Achievement, and a number of honorary doctorates by universities throughout the world. Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Dr. Michael W. Apple. Dr. Apple.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to speak to people. I'm sorry that I can't be there. I assure you that the weather is probably warmer in Manila and other parts of the Philippines than it is here, where there is a foot of snow on the ground. So there are other reasons I wish to be closer to you. I want to, again, thank Andrew for a very provocative and thoughtful, and I think quite complete analysis. So again, I think it's important that we thank each other for teaching us in many ways. I want to step back a bit. Because of my history as a teacher union leader and because of the work that I did with Palafreri and others, I come at things with a rather critical set of glasses to put on. And the question I want to raise is actually quite profound and very, very important for the kinds of things that Andrew was talking about and the entire series of lectures that have gone on. And that is, while we believe very strongly in the possibility of using service learning and other kinds of forms to help us transform society, one of the major questions that has guided critical education and almost all education since its beginning is whether it's true. Can education actually transform society? So I want us to think much more powerfully about education's role in society and whether, in fact, it can participate in changing society's inequalities. I raise this because I think that it is absolutely central that we do things that do engage with social issues. I think that service learning is absolutely central to the kinds of curriculum and pedagogy that should go on in the Philippines and schools all over the world. But I don't want us to be romantic about it at all. So let me begin by reminding us things we already know, that education is a political act and an ethical act. It is never neutral. So let me just say a few things about that. Education is political in a variety of ways. And again, most of us who've ever taught understand many of these kinds of things. Education is political first because it does, in fact, partly reproduce the social, sexual, and racial divisions and economic divisions of a larger society. Now, it doesn't do this perfectly, and I become a very fine, if flawed, example of this, in that I come from a very poor family in the third poorest city of the United States, what was called the Silk City. It was the first factory city in the United States, called Paterson, New Jersey. And there were two high schools in that city. The one I went to, less than 20% of the students went on to any form of higher education. And in the other high school, over 80% of the students not only graduated, but went on to universities and colleges. And whether I like it or not, if I know your test scores, and I know what your parents or significant others do, I can predict within one standard deviation where you will wind up. I hate that. And if it wasn't for teachers, I would not be here, since I was again predicted to have a similar kind of trajectory. So schools are relatively effective sorting devices. And part of the act of being engaged in these relational forms that Andrew was so articulate about is for us to subvert that. But it's political in another way, and that is whether the curriculum itself leads towards more democratic and relational forms. Whether I like it or not, it is like fishing. Some groups' knowledge is brought up by it. Other groups' knowledge is seen as popular, as inconsequential, as illegitimate. Third, whether we like it or not, there is a hidden curriculum in schools. That is underneath what we think we're teaching so much more. So if I was doing this in person and I went on too long, people would be doing their email, checking their computers, talking with each other, or thinking about when is this lecture going to be over. And one of the things that schools do is teach us particular kinds of ways to survive. Some of those are very, very productive. An example would be with my grandson at the age of 5, when he first went into kindergarten and first grade. As an only child, he was not very good at celebrating other students. And one of the things that schools did was to teach him that it wasn't only about him, it was about a collective community. So there are things in the hidden curriculum that become powerfully progressive. It's also political in terms of the teaching itself, whether we like it or not. Teaching has historically been constructed often in many nations as women's paid work. In any occupation that is seen as women's paid work gets less respect, less money, fewer benefits, and in fact is blamed for every social dislocation and economic dislocation. That is certainly the case in the United States. It's often the case in Brazil and many, many other nations where I work. But it's also political about money and power. Some groups' voices are heard, other groups' voices are not heard. And finally, it is deeply political in terms of national policies and national agendas. Now, the Philippines, mind you, has a very strong political system, often a repressive one in certain areas. And that means that education is not free to do certain kinds of things. Now, in order to understand then this question, we have to begin with the reality that there are differential power relations. And again, as Joel reminded us and as Andrew reminded us, there are certain things that teachers can and cannot do. And there are certain things that we can try to do, but we must be deeply cognizant of what may happen if we cross the border. It doesn't do us any good if we don't think about those kinds of things. Now, in order to do this, in order to think more clearly about this question about whether education can transform society or change society, I want us to use two sets of glasses, two sets of conceptual apparatuses to think about this. The first is what I want to call relational analysis, and that is different than what Andrew so coherently discussed about relations. Relational analysis says this: anything the institution or form must be seen in its relations with the relations of dominance and subordination, and to struggles against that for a more democratic form in a larger society. Let me make this practical. Here are the notes that I have for my lecture. And when I was forming this lecture, I walked into my building, the teacher education building at the University of Wisconsin. I was in Wisconsin rather than China at the time. I walked up the stairs, I walked into my office, I turned on the light, I turned on the computer, I went to PowerPoint, and I began to type. So I engaged in a small number of physical things, but that isn't really what happened. Yes, Michael Apple walked up the stairs, I walked into my office, I turned on the light, I turned on the computer went on, and I began to type. But in my city, whether I like it or not, we burn coal to produce electricity. And that means that I had, in order for me to give a lecture to you, to do my work, to assist you in your labors and your very important work with students and teaching and curriculum, in order for that to go on, I had an anonymous but no less real relationship with the miners who dug the coal, many of whom die each year, and many of whose children suffer from asthma and other things because of the coal dust that surrounds their villages and towns. So whether I like it or not, even doing good educational work connected me to relations that are invisible to me, but I must struggle to make them visible. And it means that I owe a debt to these people because I could not do my work without their labor. The second concept is what we call repositioning. That is the second set of glasses I want us to put on to think about whether our work can truly be successful, is to say that whether I like it or not, Michael Apple is white, I grew up very, very poor, but now I am middle class. I teach at an excellent university, even though I went to night school to get my teaching degree at one of the least reputable colleges, teachers' colleges in the United States. So I must look through and I'm male. So I must look at the world in a repositioning way. I must look at the world through eyes that say, how does people who are not me understand it? How do women? How do people with alternate sexualities? How do people who feel oppressed in certain nations because of their religious affiliations? How do they see the world? And I must struggle constantly to see the world through. I'm trying to get out of this app now. We're back. I'm sorry, it's a new computer, so if this happens, it is not only you who has had technical problems. So again, this becomes very, very important that we look at the world, again, not just relationally, but through the eyes of those people who do not benefit as much from the realities that we face. And this is very, very important for any faculty member or any teacher as well. Now, let me return to the question. I started out by saying the real question is, can education actually succeed in transforming society? And I now want to do something that might seem a little strange. I want to throw out the question. I don't think it's an important question because it's already been answered. It's answered by President Duterte. It's answered by former President, thank goodness, Donald Trump. It is answered in many, many nations by rightist mobilizations, by oppressive relations, and by people who have more power than educators. I want us to think about this. We are facing an organized body throughout the world that is increasingly powerful, what I want to call conservative modernization. This is a group that looks forward to an economy that is somehow less equal and wants to look backwards to the restoration of a fictitious culture that no longer exists. So I want us to think about this as an umbrella in which there are four hands holding that umbrella, and they want to convince people who feel that it is raining in education, teachers who feel that they are not respected, or that they have less say in the curriculum than they would like, or that the school regime is less democratic than they would like, parents who feel it is raining in education because they're very worried in times of economic crisis about the future of their children, children who are very, very worried because they don't see a possibility of getting decent jobs and decent pay later on. So it is raining in education. And these four groups are holding an umbrella, and their task is to beckon, to get people to come under the leadership, not of the very hardworking teachers who are working so long and so hard in the Philippines and elsewhere, but under this umbrella that has four elements. So let me say something about each of the elements on this, because these are groups who are increasingly powerful. Some of them have already been talked about by Andrew. The first, the most powerful, most strong hand on the umbrella, get us out of the rain, is what we might call neoliberals. And they believe one simple thing: private is necessarily good and public is necessarily bad. And the role of schools is to teach a knowledge that prepares students for an unequal economy. And it is an epistemological war, a war that says that knowledge that is less essential should not be taught. That knowledge that is more essential, that is economically useful, is what will be taught. And they also believe in what might be called a weak state, that the task of the state in many ways is to give more tax benefits to the economic sector and to defund schools. We can see this, for instance, in schools of teacher education throughout the world, where many, many schools of education who are in teacher education programs have been defunded in the United States, in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, in Guatemala, El Salvador, in many, many nations. And this is quite distressing. Now, there is no such thing as a weak state. Okay? Neoliberals want a very, very strong state. I'll give one example. In my own state, the state of Wisconsin, there is more money spent on prisons than all of higher education combined. That is not a weak state. That is the strongest state imaginable. We are basically saying that we will pay to private or public prisons money so that people will be fed and clothed and housed, get very poor education, provided they are willing to be in prison. Now, I want to use that as a grotesque but very real example that is not neoliberalism saying that we want a weak state. It is actually a vast tax transfer policy in which money that should be going to support teachers, to support smaller class sizes, to support people who work with students, and that money is taken away and given to the private and public penile system, what Foucault would call the carceral state. I'm sorry to say this openly, but this is going on worldwide now. There's a second group that we might call neoconservatives, and they want a strong state. They have a cultural agenda. And that agenda says this: there is too much emphasis on service learning, too much emphasis on democratic curriculum, too much emphasis on minority groups, on the cultures of women, on religious diversity. We must return to what dominant groups believe is the real knowledge. So an example would be something like this. Another example from the United States, where the state of Texas approved a textbook that said that enslaved people were, and I quote now, came to the United States to find better jobs. So it erased the history of enslavement, and there would be no economy in the United States if there hadn't been the enslavement of African descent people. Well, this is quite a tragic situation, but we cannot understand the possibility of service learning unless we understand that there will be groups saying that is unimportant knowledge and that is knowledge that is not to be taught. So unless we now think carefully about what we will do to defend the teachers and the students and the parents who will be deeply involved in this, we are not dealing with reality. There is a third group, which is the fastest growing group internationally with its hand on this umbrella, and this is what we call authoritarian populists. That is, they believe that the people must decide, but there's good people and bad people. And these are often very conservative religious forms, and I want to be cautious saying this because I want to be deeply respectful for religious commitments. And in fact, I work with religious evangelicals and others throughout the world. And in fact, when I was unfortunately arrested in Korea for speaking out against the military dictatorship, those groups that were arrested with me were all religiously affiliated people. And I quote from them, Jesus worked with the poor. That is what I will devote my life to doing. So do not misinterpret my analysis here and my points that I'm making. But these are groups who say God only speaks to me, not to you. And these are groups who believe that there are real people, and again, people who should not be listened to. We can see this, for instance, right now in Pakistan. We can see it increasingly in Israel and Palestine. We can see it in the United States, where the fastest growing school reform now is not voucher schools, is not charter schools, it is not private schools, it is homeschooling. Where homeschools, where children are pulled out of religious schools, are pulled out of private and public schools, and are now schooled by ultra-conservative ideological groups and ultra-conservative religious groups who see that, I quote now, teachers are tools of the devil. I can't believe these words are said. and these are groups as well who believe very, very strongly that they must have gated communities to keep their children safe from children who have different religious beliefs, who are African descent, who are immigrants, etc. Finally, there's a group that Andrew did point to very powerfully, and that is what we might call new managerialism. And this is a group that would never vote for Duterte, your president, would never vote for Boris Johnson in the UK, would never vote as well for those people who would support our former president, thank goodness, Donald Trump. So they are often liberals, they believe in democracy, but they have a cultural capital, a form of skills around testing and accountability. And they believe one simple thing: if it moves in classrooms and teachers engage in it, test it. And if it doesn't move yet, test it anyway in case the teacher or the curriculum moves tomorrow. Now, all of these people under this umbrella demonstrate how schools can participate in changing society because they are engaged in it. Schools have become the laboratories for these kinds of things. Now, what are the alternatives to this? Well, in order to understand that, we have to see that we have to answer the question, what do schools do? And this actually helps us answer the question of whether schools can transform the society in which we all live. First, we have to understand that schools are integral parts of an economy. They are workplaces. People labor in them. Struggling in schools to make them more democratic, to get more resources in them, to get more respect for teachers, is struggling in the economy. And that means when people tell us there's nothing we can do in schools until the economy changes and we can convince factory owners and other groups of people and the banks and large capital firms that there's nothing we can do until we change the economy, they all forget that schools are not separate from the economy. They are parts of the economy. People cook there for the children. People teach. People are leaders and principals. Teachers, there are people who are psychologists. There are people who are curriculum workers. In the United States, there are also people who guide children across highways so they don't get killed when they're trying to cross the street. So schools increasingly have to be seen as places where our just everyday struggles to gain respect, to be paid what we deserve. So the average work week of a teacher in the United States right now is 58 hours a week. So anytime we have people who are working that hard, we must show our respect and organize to have them treated with respect. So when people tell you there's nothing you can do because we cannot do anything, we are not in the factories at all, we can't change the banks, remind them that you are also working. Now, schools are also places that certify knowledge, places that say some groups' knowledge are official, are legitimate, and struggles over that, getting more democratic curriculum, as Andrew pointed to, is absolutely central. Because in the larger society and the media, the knowledge that is seen as legitimate may not be democratic. But schools, because of the work of teachers and communities and often student voices, are called upon actually, even before the rest of society changes, to teach much more relevant knowledge, to respond to students' interests and needs, and to have students themselves be seen as epistemologists. And what I mean by that is that they are creators of knowledge that is based on their own lived experience. An example would be in Porto Alegre in Brazil, where for a number of years, teachers were paid an extra month's salary to go into communities led by the students in their classes to understand the music, the culture, the everyday science, the uses of mathematics in daily life, and even cooking in the community the religious impulses and traditions in the community, and with the students to bring that back to the schools as the fundament, the foundations for taking the national curriculum and making it seem connected to the real cultures and lives and hopes and dreams of the community and the kids. So schools become the sites of which collective memories are reproduced and transformed and made legitimate. Schools are also identity creators. And this I take very, very personally. Again, I come from a very, very poor family, went to a school that had 60 kids in a classroom. And in fact, when I went back to teach in those slums, I had 51 students in my first class and only half that number of textbooks and desks. But some teachers somehow saw something in me that said, Michael, we will not let you or anyone in this class fall behind. So even, it's something that I want to remember all the time, that my identity as someone who can speak about this has its roots in my family as well, but profoundly in teachers who said, we see something in our students that we cannot let die. But schools are also sites of social movement creation. Will say, you cannot let my student fail. And teachers will say that as well. And what we know from massive amounts of research, some that I have written about in Can Education Change Society and elsewhere, that parents and community activists mobilize around the issues that are part of their daily life. And when you go into communities, even poor communities, and you speak to parents about their wishes for their children, is that the students are powerfully treated as being fine, as being respected, as being able to have a relevant future. So social movements often grow around schools. And to the extent that we don't recognize that, we again forget that it is not individual teachers who alone transform society. It is social mobilizations and social movements saying you can't do that to us. And the example of Black Lives Matter in the United States becomes a profound example of racial identities that are formed around schools. And in fact, in Chicago recently, when there was a teacher strike around the curriculum and about school closures, many community members supported the teachers union and went on a hunger strike. And a group of grandparents called Grandparents for Teachers said, we will starve ourselves to death if you close these schools and if you lay off these teachers. So again, what we want to understand is that by seeing the possibility of social movements, we also are building alliances that are profoundly important with communities. Schools are also sites for developing and learning tactics. These social movements will try and sometimes fail. And failure is a profoundly important teaching device. And what we are seeing in many nations is as teachers and communities and students work together, trying to transform the curriculum to make it more democratic. They are learning how to do this. It's not natural. There's no textbooks that say, do this now. It must be done by doing it. And finally, schools are sites of social experimentation. That is, they are places in which teachers are trying things out. So when Andrew talked about democratic schools and trying to make schools more democratic sites and listening to students and hearing students and community voices, most teachers in the United States, for instance, don't take coursework on that. That is, they are taking courses on curriculum development. They're taking courses right now on how to deal with the multiplicity of tests that they must give, or on discipline, or on how to have performance testing and how to deal with it. But the things that are being lost are the history of schools being places in which social experiments go on. So this becomes, again, these are the ways in which schools already become sites of social transformation. And in fact, I think one of the things we must never do is to accept the cynicism that says we are powerless. The history of education is the history not of powerlessness at all. I'll give one concrete example, and it's again a personal one. When I became a teacher, I was trained to be a teacher in the US Army during a time when all young men had to serve. It wasn't my favorite time, but I came out as Sergeant Apple, and I was hired without a college degree, with only 1 year of college. I'm at a small teacher's college, but I could speak Espanol. I could say, "Me llamo Miguel Manzana." You'll forgive the Spanish. I've forgotten almost all of my Espanol, unfortunately. And because most teachers surrounding me were women, I was paid more as a teacher without a university degree. I was paid $1,000 more than women teachers earned with master's degrees. Women teachers originally did not get pensions. They could not continue teaching. They were married. If they were pregnant, they were let go. In most nations of the world, that is seen as laughable now. Teachers have a very, very long history of saying, "You must treat me and my students with respect." Okay, I want to now turn to an example of how this works. So I want to look at what could be called service learning, but I think that it is. Andrew mentioned that many people are a little worried that things get called service learning because it tends to minimize the understanding that people have of the relations of dominance and subordination or the importance of their work. So this is an example that might be called service learning, but no one in this example called it service learning. Okay? I want to take us into a city, the third poorest city of its size in the United States, called Baltimore. It's about 50 miles from Washington, D.C. It is one of the most residentially, racially segregated cities in the United States. Its budget is going down. It's as if it's been flushed through down the toilet. The schools are segregated. It is about 80 to 90% minoritized students, mostly Black, immigrant, and what we now call Latinx students, Spanish-speaking English language learners in the schools. The class size has gone up from an average of about 27 to, in secondary schools, in some classes in 40s and 50s. Many teachers have been laid off and have been replaced by teachers from this thing that I don't agree with, called Teach for America, where teachers come with university degrees or college degrees and are paid much less than existing veteran teachers. And they have 8 weeks in the summer of teacher education, and they are put then in the most challenging schools in the United States. There is now Teach Chile, Teach Argentina, Teach China, Teach Brazil. This is now worldwide. Teach India, name the country. You'll have to email me to tell me whether there's also Teach Philippines. It's a complicated situation. Now, this was a joint project between social studies teachers and mathematics teachers in advanced middle schools and beginning secondary school students. These students are 13, 14, and 15 years old. Now, the teachers all knew that the children would probably fail mathematics. About 90% of the students were failing, in part because the state mandated and city mandated curriculum was quite disconnected from real life. It was mostly memorization, and it was stuff for tests. And the mathematics, such as in algebra or beginning statistics, was used as the sorting device for the next part of students' public school placements. So depending on how well you did in mathematics, you were then either put in remedial classes or you basically dropped out. So about 50% of the students were not legally dropping out, but they had ceased coming to schools. And the teacher said, we simply cannot allow this to happen. Now, the Algebra Project is a project that is now spread through a number of countries, and certainly it is spread in the United States. And it says this: we are not doing poor and minoritized students any favors if we are not teaching them the knowledge that is on the examinations. So we will refuse to have simply remedial classes where the students who are poor and Black and brown, or Hmong from Vietnam, we will refuse to not teach them these courses. But we must connect it to their daily lives, because otherwise we know what will happen. So we must take risks. We must take that national and state curriculum and transform it so it makes a difference in students' lives. So this is the social action component of what Andrew was talking about, but again, not called social service learning. And the first thing they did, having been influenced by some of my work in democratic schools, but especially Paulo Freire's work on dialogic and critical pedagogy, they said to the students, look, we're not going to teach anything right now. We're going to spend a week saying, what are the social problems that you face every day right now in schools and in your community? And what we want to do is to try and use the knowledge that you will help us teach to make a difference in these. So the students spent 2 or 3 days just talking publicly with the teachers in the Algebra Project and the social studies teachers about what they are facing. And it got very gritty and quite honest. And one of the things that came up and repeatedly from the students' voices was the fact, as largely Black minoritized students, every time they're walking on the streets by themselves or in a group, they would be stopped by the police and searched, because the stereotype was that poor students who were dressed in a particular way and walked with a loose body, as the police might call it, must in fact be gang members and must in fact be doing illegal things. And the students said, this is horrific. When we walk to school, we are stopped. When we walk back from school, we are stopped. When 3 or 4 of us do what is called hanging out on a street corner because our apartments are so crowded because our families are large, or families have been evicted from their apartments, so they have moved in with relatives, we need a place just to talk. So we're out on the street corners. And the police come, and we are often arrested for doing things that non-minoritized students, white students, would be given a warning or would not get arrested at all. So the stereotypes of us are profound. And then they kept talking, and then they said, look, we also know that this has to be stopped because the money that was supposed to go to education in Baltimore has now been taken from the city, and the state is going to build a new juvenile prison on the borders of our community. And we know that what will happen is that we, the students who are in your teachers' classes, will wind up incarcerated. And the money that would go for teachers, for the health care of the elderly, for social workers, for rent help, for all kinds of things, for smaller class sizes, has been taken away. We know what will happen. We will wind up in jail. We want to stop the juvenile prison. So the students were part of the curriculum they're supposed to learn is beginning statistics. So they looked at all the data that shows that juvenile crime had dropped by 47% over the last decade in their community. And they began working with critical journalists to publicize this. And at the same time, they documented where the money going to the prison was coming from. in the same way that I mentioned that in my own state, money from education and healthcare went to the prison system. And 1 out of every 4 Black young men in my state is now in prison. And in Baltimore, that is what they refused to recognize. That's what the state said. That can't be true, but it was. So the students then formed an alliance with a large number of critical journalists. They formed an alliance as well with groups, with unions and construction workers. And they formed an alliance with the community, and they formed an alliance with their teachers and teacher unions. And that alliance then was actually quite profound in its paradoxical use of the stereotypes. The teachers and the students and the communities contacted the radio stations, the newspapers, and especially the TV and podcasts. And the stereotype of these Black young women and young men was that they don't care about education, they're not very articulate, they're not very intelligent. And the students prepared presentations that were extraordinarily powerful based on data and went on to be broadcast using the stereotypes that said, well, these students are just, well, we'll give them something. We'll give them 5 minutes on the local news or on the local talk radio. And repeatedly, the students were asked to come back to spend an hour on a talk radio thing, an hour on a special news broadcast about the community. Now, this is quite remarkable. It is a change epistemologically in who is considered a learner, who is considered someone who is articulate, who is considered at the same time someone who can teach the teachers what the reality is and how to connect the curriculum that still had to have the official knowledge that was tested. How to connect that curriculum to the daily lives, but also how to transform the futures of those students so the jail was not built. Now, this is a profoundly important story. And to call it simply service learning, while it is, and a powerful example, is to forget what it was. It was a transformation of the community, a transformation in the relationships between the parents and the school, a transformation in the relationships between the teachers and the students. And it was an embodiment of Paulo Freire's argument that teachers must be learners and students must be teachers at one and the same time. That a truly democratic curriculum and a truly democratic pedagogy is dialogic. The mutuality of learning, the sharing of power becomes crucial. I want to spend some time, I wanted to spend some time on this to point out, again, as a model of the epistemological forms that are going on, how it transforms students, how it transformed teachers and their understanding of where knowledge comes from, how an integrated curriculum that integrates subject areas and integrates schools to larger social issues can have truly momentous effects. But again, I don't want us to be honest. In order to do this, hard work had to go on. That is, we should not assume that any of these people holding that umbrella that I talked about before, that any of these groups are going to applaud constantly and say, how lovely. But certain things went on that made it easier for these teachers to get legitimacy. When the standardized tests in mathematics were given, 70% of the students scored 1 standard deviation higher. They passed it. Now, I don't like using test scores as the only way to justify what I find democratic forms. But on the other hand, we live in a world where we make decisions whose effects may be powerful, but the results may call forth particular attacks on the teachers who are doing such marvelous work and on the students who have trusted the teachers to guide them. So I want us to remember that in order to get these going, it requires that we build alliances, but also it makes teacher unions and groups of teachers in schools, no longer seeing that what I did, close the door so I could do good things, that it has to be teachers in solidarity with each other, with school leaders, as Andrew mentioned, taking risks, sciences, and democratic norms and values in the school. So let us go into this realistically, but let us remember that our job is even more important than any of these people holding the umbrella are willing to admit. And to be a teacher is already to be committed to social transformation. So let me end by thanking you for your work and thanking the teachers who taught me to make it possible for me to give this lecture to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Apple. That was an eye-opening and enlightening talk. Let me just point out some of the highlights that Dr. Peterson presented. Dr. Apple presented. Dr. Apple invited us to think and reflect if and how education can change and transform society. He presented certain issues, how schools sort learners, what knowledge is deemed essential, power of the hidden curriculum, which is at times neglected, the lack of support for teachers, student stereotyping, and the political issues surrounding education. So indeed, we have a lot of things to think about, look at the world, to look at realities, to listen to the experiences of teachers and learners. He gave us a picture of the four groups under an umbrella who influence education society: the neoliberalists, the conservatists, the populists, and the managerialists. He invited us to revisit our definition of schools, that schools are workplaces, schools are part of the economy, schools are places that create and certify knowledge, schools are identity creators, and that they are sites for social movement and social experimentation. And by knowing these purposes, I suppose we can possibly address the question, can education really change society? So thank you very much, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Apple. We are grateful, both of you, for sharing your wisdom and personal experiences. And our teacher participants have a lot to ponder and think about. To enrich the discussion, we shall have the reactions coming from the Director of the Teacher Education Secretariat, Department of Education, Dr. Run V. Manguera, and from the Secretary General of the University of Santo Tomas, Father Jesus Miranda Jr. of the Order of Preachers. We can start with Dr. Manguera. Dr. Manguera, you have the floor.
Okay, good morning to everyone. Thank you for giving us thought-provoking questions that really moved us to think about the role of the schools in education in general in transforming society. So I would like to start from my reaction to Professor Andrew Peterson. Experts define service learning as a form of experiential education in the service of others. Or for others, it's a pedagogy of teaching and learning which is curricular-based, meaning students gain knowledge and enhance its understanding of concepts by participating and organizing activities based on the identified community needs. And as a result, students are able to reflect on their learning, both, of course, academically and personally. As a way to democratize society, service learning is aimed to mold and educate students to become responsible citizens, which is a basic thing in a democratic society. So I would like to highlight on the participation, of course, and organization of activities based on the needs of the community. I would like to associate this with the term used by our speaker, the double benefit, as mentioned by Dr. Peterson. Because oftentimes when we think of service, we only think of what we have and how we can help the community. But in service learning, needs assessment is a primordial concern. So why build a bridge without a river? Thus, if a community, for example, has an environmental concern, find ways and means to teach or train students or maybe the people in the community to be equipped with the skills that they need in order for them to contribute in the environmental issues that their communities are confronting with. Of course, we have to make sure that the members of the community are involved. I like the term community partners mentioned by Dr. Peterson. The community in the development, involve the community, of course, in the development of the program or project. So in this way, as organizers, we can build our trust from the community, and it will help us to make the project or program successful. And as social studies teachers, because most of our participants here are social studies teachers, there are, of course, challenges that we have to face in the introduction, for example, of service learning. For example, I have here well, it's not really a reaction, but more of a question, because there's a mention here of 5 years time frame for the project. And the challenge, of course, for us is because in the Philippines, you only have 10 months in a year. How do we ensure that there is continuity in the project that we introduce in one particular grade level, that it will continue up to the next grade level and so on. There is also this question that realization that struck me. It's how can we introduce to the young minds of the children that, you know, charity is more than monetary donations. You know, part of our culture is when there is a calamity here, where there is calamity, we always ask our students to bring some donations, and we ask donations from the children. Or maybe you can help us think more of other ways on how we can teach our children the concept of charity. So on the next speaker, the question is, of course, has moved me. That on the question, can education transform society? Of course, my personal response is a yes, because as you all know, based on experience and also with the experience of Professor Apple, my education, of course, has helped me contribute more in the bigger society. So education has transformed me who I am now, and it is through education that I'm able to provide the needs of my family. So let me also end my sharing and by stating that there are so many challenges that we are facing right now. For example, in terms of participation of the students, if ever we'll engage our students to service learning, how can we involve our young students as young as 6, 7 years old in this service learning pedagogy? Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for your sharing. I learned a lot from what you have shared this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Runvi Manguera. Dr. Peterson or Dr. Apple, would you like to say something, or you have something to add?
Yeah, Joe, thank you, and thank you very much for the thoughts and the reflections. I just perhaps will come to the point about the time frame, because you asked a direct question, as I understood it, about the time frame that's involved. And I think obviously Michael has spoken very powerfully about the challenges, but also the strengths that exist in communities. And I think in the example I used, this was just a way of the teacher sort of framing that the engagement has to be real and sustained and meaningful. And it's about, I think Michael used the term about alliances, and it's about forging those alliances and that relationship with community. And it can, you know, when we talk about that, it sounds quite grand, but it's how children can have space, which may be in a shorter period of time. So rather than about an event or even necessarily about a process, it's about that engagement and that building relationships of children starting to explore appropriate to their age, and obviously with depth according to their age, but starting to explore their sense of community and their relationship with the community, and understand their community, including themselves as assets within the community and communities as assets, and also the pressures on those communities, again, that Michael spoke about very eloquently, and providing them with space to learn and reflect. Now that might happen in a very condensed form, but it might happen over a longer period of time in ways that are either deep in terms of one project or almost like an ongoing commitment within the democratic ethos of the school and the commitment of the young people themselves. So I don't think we should necessarily get too sort of over focused on the timelines, but to think about, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve, and recognize in young people and in communities, and providing that space for engagement and that space for learning.
Dr. Andrew, there's a follow-up question. In what way can you suggest to better train or prepare learners to become an effective pupil project manager when conducting service learning, considering their very young age? I think you mentioned about pupil project management. How can they do that considering the age of these pupils?
I think it's a really interesting question, and schools will already have ways in which they develop pupil leadership and sort of more formal training that can occur. But I think really it's about listening to young people and providing them with spaces. And in the research that conducted across various contexts, often it's perhaps the denial or perhaps the lack of ability for some of the pressures that Michael spoke about. It's about providing young people with the space to learn with others and to give them confidence. And I think one thing that's absolutely crucial for children, particularly working in disadvantaged communities, and what you say, I'm going to make a very general statement. So there would be qualifications to this, but oftentimes from my own educational experience and working in schools and different programs, what you recognise in children who are disadvantaged is perhaps the lack of confidence in themselves. I don't want to use the word self-esteem because I think that's problematic, but the lack of confidence born from a lack of opportunity and a lack of support. And so often for teachers, it's about finding ways to build confidence in young people and a sense of efficacy and a sense of empowerment. And that might start off very small. It might start off in a very safe context and safe space, as it were. But I think, you know, recognizing young people and giving young people the confidence that they can have a role, however small that role may be, is absolutely crucial. So there's sort of a more formal training side of it, the more procedural side of it, but there's also the sense of connecting with young people and recognizing the assets and the strengths that they bring, which may occur outside. You know, one thing that we recognize a lot is the difference in how children often behave and conduct themselves in schools to their home lives, and whether that's through their religious affiliations or social affiliations or sports affiliations. Sometimes young people are leaders in their communities outside of school, and then when they come into school, that's denied or restricted in important ways. So it's about finding ways to engage and to connect with young people and to develop their confidence to lead and to work with others.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. For Dr. Apple, there's a question here regarding how we can possibly address or improve teacher training in connection to what you mentioned about real knowledge and repositioning, how people actually see the world.
This is one of the most important questions that we could ask. First of all, I mentioned the pressures that are facing us. An example would be something like this. Right now in the United States and in many, many other nations, there's pressure to close colleges of teacher education, to move all teacher education to a graduate level, or literally, as I mentioned with Teach for America, to say that anyone can be a teacher. So the legislature in the state of Wisconsin, which historically has been very progressive, is now retrogressive. It's a populist authoritarian form, has said, why do we need teacher education? That we should stop funding it, that anyone who wants to be a teacher can be a teacher. And in fact, why do we want even people with university who wants to be a teacher with a small amount of training and become one? Now, I don't want to be someone who's saying, oh my God, the house is on fire. But it seems to me that we cannot answer that kind of question unless we understand what also has to go on. So I want us to take relational analysis very, very seriously. You can't do it unless you understand the depth of the problem. Secondly, we must publicize powerfully the kinds of things that are necessary for good teachers. So often what happens is that we teachers are not listened to. I've been in a movement right now where we are establishing, for instance, radio programs where for 1 hour every week, it's teachers talking to the community about what is really going on in their lives, what is necessary, what kind of support they need, just honest talk that is not just about bad things, but here's the kinds of things that they're doing. So since so many people now are listening to talk radio in the United States, in the UK, in India, and elsewhere, why should it be that the authoritarian populists colonize that space? So many of us are pretty good talkers. So let's have spaces in national radio or local radio and elsewhere in the Philippines where teachers are talking about what is necessary, what their lives are like, and to have students also join them. So there are certain things I think that are quite practical and needs to be done in order to save teacher education, but also to build those communities where people are working together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Apple. Our participants for today are mainly social studies teachers at the basic education level, and I'm pretty much sure that these are committed Filipino teachers, and I believe that it's high time that we listen really to teachers and listen to their voices. So thank you very much to our speakers for responding to our participants' questions. Many of our participants shared their appreciation for a very interesting and a very enlightening session. Okay, considering how busy our speakers are, not to mention the time difference, I believe in the UK it's past 3 a.m. and late evening in Madison. To show our appreciation to the speakers, we shall now award them with a certificate of appreciation. And we shall also be doing the same with our reactors. Allow me to read the citation in the certificate. The University of Santo Tomas Research Center for Social Sciences and Education, Fondazione Gravissimo Educationis in partnership with the Teacher Education Council, Department of Education, Manila, Philippines, awards the Certificate of Appreciation to Brun V.V. Manguera, PhD, for sharing his invaluable insights and experiences as a panelist reactor during the TECovid-19 Colloquy series with the theme Understanding 21st Century Democracy, given this 23rd of January, 2021. Signed by Professor Alan de Guzman, Vatican Project Lead of the Philippine Antenna, and Professor Belinda de Castro, PhD, Director of the USTRC said. Thank you very much, Dr. Manguera. We shall be awarding a certificate as well to our esteemed speakers. Again, allow me to read the citation. The University of Santo Tomas Research Center for Social Sciences and Education, Fondazione Gravissimum Educationis, in partnership with the Teacher Education Council of the Department of Education, would like to award this certificate of appreciation Professor Andrew Peterson, PhD, for sharing his invaluable insights and experiences as keynote speaker on the topic Doing Service Learning as a Way to Democratize Society during the TECovid-19 Colloquy series with the theme Understanding 21st Century Democracy, given this 23rd of January 2021, signed by Professor Alan de Guzman, Vatican Project Lead, Professor Belinda de Castro, Director of the USDRC said, and the Executive Director of the Teacher Education Council, Runvi V. Manguera, PhD. Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you.
We'll be sending you the e-certificate through email. And we're awarding as well a similar certificate to Professor Michael Apple, okay, for sharing his invaluable insights and experiences as plenary speaker on the topic, Can Education Change Society? So thank you very much, Dr. Apple.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So again, thank you very much to our speakers, to our participants. Let's give them a virtual and hearty applause. Okay. The Democracy Project does not end with this series of webinars. We have quite a long way to go to fully realize the goals of this project. So to give you an update regarding the third phase of the Democracy Project, please welcome the project lead of the Philippine Antenna, the 2011 Metrobank Foundation most outstanding teacher, and the 2019 awardee for continuing excellence and service. Please welcome Professor Dr. Alan de Guzman.
Thank you very much, Sir Joel. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
May I be allowed to share my screen?
May I request the EdTech host to change the status, please, from panelist to co-host.
Okay, I think I'm sharing my screen now, Sir Joel.
Yes.
Can you all see my screen now?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to all the Filipino teachers who are present in this webinar series, and of course to our two distinguished speakers for this morning, Dr. Apple and Dr. Peter. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My task for this morning is to give you, of course, a concluding remark and to punctuate our participation in this 8-part webinar series on 21st century democracy. Allow me then, of course, to inform the members of the group, our dear participants, that your participation in this 8-part webinar series is part of a 3-year funded research project which started in 2019 and will conclude in 2021, sponsored and funded by the Fondazione Gravissimum Educationis. This project involves 15 universities across the world, specifically across 14 countries. And you will see now that these are now the countries participating in this 3-year project in North America, Europe, Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, particularly the Philippines. My dear colleagues, all of you will agree with me that the global health pandemic in 2020 has given us a big paralysis across different fields, from manufacturing to health to business to information technology, agriculture, transportation, and to the field where we belong, the field of education. Very hard on our part to run the second year simply because our original plan was to do the webinar or the seminar series now on a face-to-face mode. But I think the global health pandemic has, of course, allowed us to experience a kind of migration from our face-to-face traditional mode of teaching to the one of online platform teaching. And I'm pretty sure all of you will agree with me with my basic assumption that for the last several months, we have been, of course, attending a number of seminars, a number of webinars, meetings in the departments or institutional conferences using different platforms. And I believe that the year 2020, although the year of pandemic, I would still, of course, say that we are so blessed. Why am I saying this? simply because all of us in this world happen, of course, to experience the gift of quarantine. We also experience during the quarantine the gift of family togetherness. All of us teachers manage to experience the gift of work from home. And even, of course, to our students and some of our teachers during their free time, the gift of Netflixification. We also enjoyed the gift of social media, the gift of video conferencing, the gift of series of webinars left and right, and even, of course, the gift of new learnings. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear colleagues, all of you will agree with me that for the last 6 months, since August to January 2021, all of us managed to enter and even enjoy the gift of teacher agency in strengthening democracy. As the Latin expression would always put it, tempus fugit. Time flies so fast. You may still remember the first time we saw each other last August 15, and we were all struggling in the Microsoft Teams. Now, on the 23rd of January, we are officially punctuating the year 2 of our implementation of the democracy project in the Philippines. So in behalf of the Philippine Local Antenna, yours truly, Doc Alan de Guzman from the University of San Tomas, and 2 of my collaborators, Associate Professor Joel Adamos, Professor Belinda V. De Castro. We would like, of course, to take this opportunity to thank our dear speakers, our highly esteemed and distinguished speakers from August to January. Thank you very much to Tina, Edson, Sorpong, Jert. Thank you so much to Barbara, to David, to Carrie Jan, to Teresa, to Mark Anthony, and of course, our speakers for this morning, Andrew Peterson and Michael Apple. Our heart overflows with sincerest thanks for your gift of person and gift of expertise. Of course, we would like to also express our biggest and sincerest thanks to Professor Monsignor Girial Tiverge, the Secretary General of the Fundación Gravissimum Educationis, for giving us the opportunity to work on this worthy project for 3 years. And of course, we would like to express also our biggest and sincerest thanks to the Office of Director, Office of the Vice Rector, Office of the Secretary General, the Social Media Bureau of the University of San Tomas. This seminar would not have been possible without the technical assistance of our UST Educational Technology Center, headed by Associate Professor Ana Cheryl Ramos, and assisted by the able Assistant Director, Assistant Professor April Joy Gascon. We would like also to thank and extend our gratitude to all our session moderators, chat box moderators, our technical staff, our support staff, and even our residents and alumni journalists. This afternoon will never be complete without the team expressing our biggest thanks to the Departments of Education, specifically to the Teacher Education Council, headed by the Executive Director, Dr. Runvi Manguera. And of course, to our tech representatives, Dr. Rita May Tagalog, Dr. Evelyn Chavez, Dr. Mina Libutake, our tech secretariat, Jason Peñafiel, and Ms. Donabel Bihasa. We also would like to express our sincerest gratitude to the National Educators Academy of the Philippines, headed by Professor Dr. John Shena. Thank you also so much to our regional supervisors, to the division superintendents, our school principals, for allowing your teachers, our 730 teachers from all over the country, including a select group of faculty members from the Philippine Science High School, to participate in this 8-part webinar series. From the bottom of our heart, thank you very much. My dear colleagues, as I was reflecting, of course, for what happened for the last 6 months, I am asking now the biggest question. At the end of the day, we ask ourselves the question, what exactly is the essence of our participation, our active engagement in this 8-part webinar series. Listening to our distinguished speakers, I could not find, of course, the best term to capture what exactly is the participation. But allow me then, of course, with the humble heart, to share with you that after 8-part webinar series, this can be concretized with the word or by the word sensitization. I love the word sensitization. Why am I saying this? Allow me then to share with you a beautiful story, a beautiful anecdote. If a person is drowning in a pool, any one of these can possibly happen. 1, I hear the call for help, but I cannot swim, so I cannot save him. Second possibility, I do not hear the call because I am deaf, and I do not save him, although I can swim. My dear colleagues, look at the third possibility. I hear the call, and although I cannot swim, I attempt to save him, and we both die. Fourth, I hear the call, and I can swim, but I refuse to help him, and he dies. And look at the most wonderful possibility. I hear the call, and I can swim, and I respond and save him. My dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the democracy that we have in the Philippines and the rest of the world is a gift from God. And these are the causes of failure to save the drowning man and the causes of possible failure why democracy might die in some parts of the world. If you remember the first possibility, I heard a call for help, but I cannot swim, so I cannot save him. This as an indication of our inability. The second possibility that talks about, I do not hear the call because I am deaf. I do not save him, although I can swim, is a big indication of our big insensitivity as teachers. Third, I hear the call, and although I cannot swim, I attempt to save him, and we both die. Simply stated, my dear colleagues, this is an indication of our tragic, pathetic goodwill. The fourth possibility that says, I heard a call and I can swim, but I refuse to help him and he dies, is a clear indication of our plain bad will. Professor Dr. Apple was telling us that most of the time, teachers are not listened to. But I would like, of course, to underscore that this webinar series is not yet over, because the voices of teachers will be clearly called, will be clearly heard, because I hear the call and I can swim and I respond and save him, simply because this is our ability to respond, our positive and proactive response, because I believe that Filipino teachers are responsible teachers. The word sensitization can be best seen in the sharing of Peter Anderson when he mentioned of relational principles and pedagogies. How I wish I can read this book entitled Compassion and Education. And also, sensitization is best captured in the sharing of Professor Michael Apple when he posted the question, can education succeed in transforming society? Can education succeed in transforming Philippine society? I hope his book, Can Education Change Society, published by Routledge, will give us more inspiration and dig deeper into how to answer this question posted by this luminous scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, the Philippine local antenna team remains to be hopeful even after this webinar. Why? Because in 2017, in the book published by Ralph Korenz entitled Existentialism and Education, he did emphatically emphasize that hope exists only in relation to the future. We cannot talk about hope from the perspective of the past. We cannot even understand hope from the perspective of the present. We can only, of course, understand and enjoy hope because it does exist only in relation to the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the overall belief of the Philippine Local Antenna Democracy Team, regardless of our modes of instruction, whether this is done on a face-to-face mode, whether we do this one on a virtual mode, we still believe that the classroom remains to be as the most radical space of possibility in the academy. And for years, it has been a place where education has been undermined by teachers and students alike, who seek to use it as a platform for opportunistic concerns rather than as a place to learn. Also, Otto Friedrich Bollnow introduced the term sense of morningness. I hope, my dear colleagues, our dear participants, those who are listening and even watching from our YouTube, I would like you, of course, to remember that the sense of morningness, not sense of afternoonness or sense of eveningness, but more of the morningness. Why? Because it is an optimistic mood of fresh possibilities and a crucial, effective element for education. And we are addressing this through the part 3 of our webinar series. Even Bollnow once said, the sense of morningness will always invite us that our action or inaction in the pedagogical context will contribute to the shaping of our school atmosphere. And no wonder, my dear participants, we would like to welcome you to the third part of our commitment to nurture and strengthen Philippine democracy through the certificate program in the teaching of controversial public issues and digital literacy for democratic citizenship. This certificate program, no longer a webinar, will run rather from May to August 2021. And the basic argument of this certificate program is that every teacher is a teacher of democracy. This certificate program was conceptualized because we would like to address this educational dilemma that the school's tendency to emphasize what is more ideal tends to create a disconnect between what students are supposed to learn and what they actually experience in their respective communities. Specifically, we would like, of course, to anchor our belief on what scholars would always say, that teaching controversial issues is a cornerstone of democracy education. This certificate program will have 3 specific foci. One is the teaching of controversial issues, coupled by digital literacy, and in the long run, we would like to see teachers who are empowered in the classroom through the help of the Department of Education to implement service learning and integrate it in the Philippine education, basic education level. My dear colleagues, this is the core of the program. We would like to see that teacher agency is evident in Philippine classroom, that you make decisions in response to the demands of the K-12 program, your instructional dilemmas and ambiguities surrounding the teaching of controversial topics. But of course, we would like to make this pilot program very manageable. From a pool of 730 participants who attended our webinar series for the last 6 months, only 20 will make it in the first cohort. And these 20 teachers, social studies teachers, will be spread across the 3 geographical areas in the country, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. We would like to engage these teachers to develop their critical roles as builders, their critical role as political teachers, and also as teacher improviser and teacher innovator in terms of the use of digital technology and tools in order for us to develop democratic citizenship among our students. To qualify for the certificate program, the 20 participants must have completed the 8-part webinar series on understanding 21st century democracy, which ran from August 20 to January 2021. Second, they must be willing to participate in a 3-month certificate program on a Saturday, synchronous and asynchronous. Third, since this will be delivered on a digital platform, we would like, of course, to make sure that they do own a desktop or a laptop and have a stable internet connection. And of course, they are comfortable in the use of technology. And with at least 5 years of teaching experience, with very good to outstanding teaching performance over the last 3 years, based on the records of the Departments of Education. This 20 initial cohort of teachers will be trained and will be coached by 4 faculty members from the UST, University of Santo Tomas Educational Technology Center, on the digital literacy components, and the heart of the program on the teaching of controversial topics. They will all be mentored by faculty members from the Ateneo de Manila University, the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Kennesaw State University, and the University of Nottingham. This program, of course, will only be successful if we become mindful of the following important timeline. On January 28th, we'll be, of course, releasing the list of prospective participants based on their online participation in the webinar, and we shall also be releasing the application form. Then, by February 3 of this year, that will be the deadline of submission of the completed or the filled out application forms. Then, on the 13th of February, we shall, of course, be releasing the official list of participants, 20 participants, only the first cohort, and the commitment form that they have to sign. And on the 20th of February, these 20 participants who will commit themselves to the certificate program will attend a pre-orientation, and we will also be sending our letters of acceptance to them, together with the letters of gratitude to the respective regional supervisors and their principals. My dear colleagues, as I punctuate year 2 of our implementation of the Philippine Democracy Project, allow me then to end my concluding remarks with the sunflower experience. Sunflower abounds in the northern part of the country. And allow me to share with you an article that was published in the Journal of Science sometime in 2016. And this reads, sunflowers possess a circadian rhythm, also known as sunflower heliotropism, which allows them to undergo biological processes according to the perceived stimuli from the environment. Imagine how they behave based from the stimuli from the external environment. Moving on daytime, sunflower's circadian rhythm tells its stems to allow the cells located on their eastern section to grow longer, which points the whole flower to the west. The same occurs at night for the cells on the western section of the stem, allowing the plant to point towards, this time to the east, and face the sun as it rises on the horizon. Scientists from the University of California have determined that sunflower plants always track the sun's movements during the day as they reorient towards the east as the night passes. My dear colleagues, this certificate program is a form of our reorientation. We remain hopeful that there is what you call future in strengthening democracy as far as the Republic of the Philippines is concerned. To our participants, to our speakers, thank you very much at mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Allen. I hope that our participants will apply what they have learned in the past 8 webinars to strengthen their teaching of social studies at the basic education level. And we hope that our participants will continue to partner with us, especially in the next phase of the project. We have a few more reminders for our participants. Please accomplish the evaluation form for today's webinar. You'll find the link. So the certificates of participation will be issued within the next 4 weeks. The recording of the last webinar can now be viewed online through the UST Research Center for Social Sciences and Education Facebook page. We formally end the session with a prayer and ask God continually for His unending grace. Colleagues, the hymn of the University of Santo Tomas. Thank you very much to our speakers and to our participants. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Michael.
much,
Dr.
Michael and Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.
Lovely to see you all. Thank you very much.
Hope to connect with you soon.
That would be great. You take care. Take care, Michael.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.